In this video, we're going to analyze the effect of a tariff when imposed by a small country on domestic welfare. Now, what do we mean by a small country? A small country is, by definition, one that does not impact the world price of the good. Right? So what does that mean in terms of our supply and demand analysis? Well, if we're saying that in this case, this is the US is the home country, the US would be so small in terms of global demand that whatever the world price is, it is just taking it as a given. Well, that would show up as the US, and here's our world market in this graph on the right. That means that the US is basically facing a horizontal export supply curve. It's our export supply. Or, as we said before, you can call it supply of exports, like that. And in the example that we have in the book, that's at a price of $300 per bicycle. So we take this price, right? So here's our equilibrium in our global market, and at that price we get a quantity of 1.6 million. Right? 1.6 million bicycles per year imported into the US. So, right, the world, right, our equilibrium is determined here. We take this world price and draw that back into our US market. Okay. And so this is going to be the starting point for our analysis. Right? Under free trade, the US would take a price of 300 as given. And what we'd see here is a quantity supplied, right? Production would be 0.6, and our consumption would be actually 1.6. Sorry, so that this is 1.0. Okay, 1 million. Now, right, this is free trade. So what happens if we impose a tariff? And let's say that the tariff is $30. Okay, so we're going to impose a tariff of $30. And note, we're stating the tariff in dollar terms rather than percentage terms. Right? So it's important here I want to pause here before we go into analyzing the tariff graphically and talk about the distinction between this kind of tariff, right, where it's stated in dollar terms, and what we actually see in practice, which is that tariffs are stated usually as a percentage of the value. The reason we're not analyzing tariffs that way is that because this is actually much simpler. It is important to note that everything we do here still extends to the case where instead of saying $30, we had a 10% tariff. Right? We'd get the same results, the same insights. This is just easier to take a look at in our graphs. So what happens when we impose a $30 tariff? Well, remember, a tariff is just a tax. Right? And hopefully you should have covered tax incidence in your Principles of Microeconomics class. Well, what happens when you place a tax, say, on the sellers? Well, that shifts the supply curve up by the amount of the tax. In other words, our export supply curve will simply shift up by $30. And it's still going to be a horizontal line. Right? So this is the supply, right, the export supply curve, plus the tariff. Right? And why does that make sense? Well, you want to think about, again, that a supply curve represents marginal cost, right? Is the marginal cost of supplying one more bicycle into the international market. Well, the tax is adding to that cost of supply. So we're just shifting the supply curve up, right? So it's the marginal cost of production plus this additional cost of having to pay the tax. So with that $30 tariff, what we see is, right, as the price goes up, right, the supply curve shifts up, the price fully adjusts upward by the amount of the tariff, right? $30 tariff results in a $30 increase in the price. So now we take this new price and bring this over back here into the US market, and we take a look right now at these new prices. What do we have? And with our example here, we have, as the price goes up, as you would expect, quantity supplied is going to increase. And here it goes from 600,000 to 800,000 bicycles produced by the US bicycle producers. Now, consumption, of course, will fall as bicycles become more expensive. Right? US consumers will now want to buy 1.4 bicycles per year at this higher price. So what's the difference between the 1.4 and the 0.8? Well, that is our new level of imports. Now, initially, imports was 1.6 million consumed minus the 600,000 produced domestically. They gave us our 1 million in imports. Now imports of bicycles have fallen down to 0.6 million or 600,000. So what does all of this mean in terms of our welfare changes? We go back to our analysis looking at consumer and producer surplus. Initially, consumer surplus was this big triangle starting from the intercept up on the price all the way out to 1.6 million in the quantity down to 300. But now that the price has gone up to 330, consumers are only going to be left with this smaller triangle up here. Okay. Which means they're losing all these sections down below. So we'll label these A, B, C, and D. Okay. So A is the area to the left of the supply curve. B is this triangle between 0.6 and 0.8 in our prices. C is the rectangle in here between 0.8 and 1.4. And D is this triangle between 1.4 and 1.6. Notice all of these changes all these areas are between the original world price and the new price with the tariff. So the consumers are going to lose all those areas, A, B, C, and D. What about the producers? Well, producers are now going to gain as the price goes up. Right? Initially, they had this little triangle here is surplus. Now the surplus becomes this larger area, this triangle here. Right? So they gain A. So A is really just a transfer of surplus from consumers to producers. Right? So we're making consumers worse off and producers are going to be better off as a result of this tariff. In terms of the overall surplus in the U.S. market, in the U.S. economy, it's a wash. Right? It's a transfer from one group to another. Now there's a third group, or a third area that we have to be concerned with, and that is the government, or in the government revenue. Right? It's a tax, right? A tariff is just a tax. The government is collecting tariff revenue, and that area is given by C. Right? 1.4 minus 0.8, that difference between quantity demanded and supplied at this new price of 330, right? That's the quantity of imports. And the U.S. government's collecting $30 on each of those 600,000 bicycles. So they are gaining revenue equal to area C. So what's the net effect here? Well, consumers lose A, B, C, and D, but A goes to producers and C goes to the government, which leaves us with a net loss of B and D. And we call that loss our deadweight loss. And why do we call that a deadweight loss? Well, that's because it's surplus that in the free market would have been generated here in the U.S. Market for bicycles, but because of the tariff, we're no longer getting these transactions that were mutually beneficial for consumers and producers. And we can break this down a bit more. We refer to B, area B, as the production distortion. And D, we call our consumption distortion. Why do we use those two terms? Well, if you take a look at B, B is coming about from the fact that with the higher price with the tariff, domestic producers are ramping up production. They're going from 600,000 to 800,000 bicycles. So why is that creating this deadweight loss? Well, it's because the marginal cost of producing those bicycles, right? If you look at that point on the demand curve, or the supply curve rather, if you look at this section here, remember that supply curve is telling you the marginal cost of producing those bicycles between 600 and 800,000. That is above 300, which is the price in the world market. So we're inefficient here. We're producing at a higher cost than we could buy these bicycles on the world market. And so that's where, right, the marginal cost is exceeding the global price. D is our consumption distortion, because with the higher price, the consumers are cutting their consumption by 200,000 bicycles. These 200,000 bicycles are valued at more than the world price. Remember, the demand curve tells you how much value on the margin consumers place on those units of the good. Consumers value those bicycles at more than $300, but they don't buy them because with the tariff, with the tax, the price has gone up to $330. So those two distortions are the source of our deadweight loss. Now, one interesting question we can ask is, well, what is the effective protection that is generated by tariffs in this, in these kinds of industries? So here someone might look at it and say, well, the domestic price went up by $30 or 10%, so that is effectively protecting domestic bicycle producers to the tune of a 10% higher price. In reality, it's not quite that simple. So we have this concept, what is called the effective rate of protection. Or the ERP, effective rate of protection. The effective rate of protection takes a look at the percentage change in value added when you take into account all of the tariffs in this particular industry. And why we say all the tariffs? Well, so if we continue with this example, what we have initially is a price of bicycles, world price, for our bicycles of 300. Right, that is the price that the bicycle suppliers are, right? That's what they're receiving for when they sell the bicycles. But that doesn't represent all of the value added. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that the value of the inputs that the bicycle producers are using, the value of all the inputs, so you think about all of the materials, the paints, right, the metals, all of those components are $220. Okay? So that means you have a value added of $80. Okay? And value added subtracts the value of all the purchased inputs that the manufacturer or the producer is using from the price at which they are selling their good. Okay? Now, how does the value added change if we have, as we do here, a 10% tariff on the bicycles? Okay? So we've got this tariff on the bicycles of 10%. And here, for this example, it is much easier to do this just with percentages. And let's say that all of the inputs are taxed or have a 5% tariff. So this is why I was saying a few moments ago, it's not so simple as just looking at the tariff on the final, on the final good, on the bicycle. Because the tariff on the inputs is going to raise the cost of inputs in the end for the bicycle manufacturers. So that's actually going to cut into its value added. Right? The tariff on the bicycles will actually add to the value added. So what does this mean here? So when we take the two pieces together, now we're going to have, with the tariff, we're going to have a new price, right, of $330. Again, we're just continuing with this example that we had in our graph. Right? And what happens to the price of our inputs? Okay? Well, with our 5% tariff on the inputs, the value of those inputs now with their tariff goes to, you're going to take 5% here. That's going to put it up by $11 to $2.31 for a value added of $99. Right? So the price, final price of the bicycle went up by $30, but the price of the inputs went up by 11. And all told, the value added went up from 80 to 99. So we calculate the effective rate of protection as the percentage change in that value added, which is 99 minus 80 divided by the original value added of 80, or in other words, about 24, approximately 24%, a little bit less. Okay? So that's how you calculate the effective rate of protection. And what's important to note with this concept is that you're factoring in two things that we're not seeing with this simple analysis that we did graphically. The first is the fact that the manufacturers are actually purchasing a lot of their inputs. Okay? And what we really want to focus on is the value added provided by the actual manufacturer of the bicycle. And the fact that we often will have tariffs not just on the finished product, but on the inputs themselves. Okay? So this is the analysis of a tariff with a small country. Next, we're going to turn our attention to what these different impacts look like when a large country imposes a tariff.